definition, there's logic associated with them, there's a recipe for how they're created, they include inputs and outputs, there's timing aspects to the activity, they include resources, so resources execute the activity, and there may actually be even things like raw materials involved. There's costs associated with executing the activity. There's functions, and when we're talking about functions, what we're talking about here are basically software functions. So you can make an association of a code function that's being executed by an activity in software modeling. And then finally there's associations, so you can associate an activity with a process, an organization, a role, a goal, and so forth. It's the same basic association functions that Provision gives you with other types of objects. So let's walk through some of these in detail. Activity properties definition is just basically the name and description for the activity, and each activity does need to have a unique name. Activity properties, logic, so defines how the activity operates and behaves. And again, this is an advanced topic. We're not going to get into logic editing here today, but it does support the ability to define operations and behavior. So inputs and outputs really define the deliverables that are consumed or produced by the activity. And the way you get this is actually not by clicking on the activity box. It's actually by clicking on the deliverable itself, so the connection line between the two. And you can define a deliverable here. In fact, you can actually create it directly from this menu by clicking the button here. It basically defines what is sent from one activity to another activity. And it allows you to define other aspects of it, for instance, how long it's in transit, and the units associated with that. Activities have timing properties, and timing can get fairly complex, but basically it allows you to define timing aspects of the input, the output, and then what happens in between. So you can define input and output such as FIFO and LIFO, which if you're familiar with accounting are first in, first out, last in, first out, which is really the properties of how things are picked up off of the work queue. Queuing theory I think is a little bit beyond the topic of this, but Provision does support different queuing mechanisms so that you can do process simulation, and that's really what this is about. It allows you to define a delay, so this is an amount of time that expires before the activity actually executes, and then it also allows you to define the work effort time associated with it. So you can tell it how long it takes to execute one activity. And then finally some other parameters, like you can talk about how much the resources will delay, and how much the premium time is allowed to be associated with it. Premium time being something like overtime. So this is more associated with rules associated with cost structuring. An activity can have a cost associated with it, so you can define the cost elements, whether they're direct or indirect, like an overhead rate or direct materials costs. You can associate resources with an activity, so this is basically the resource that executes the activity, whether it's a person or a processor or something of that nature. And then of course, because those are objects within Provision, you can also associate a cost with them as well. So again, these types of properties are used mostly when you're talking about process simulation. If you're just drawing a process model to have an understanding of processes, this is probably more detail than what you're going to want. But if you're actually going to run a simulation, you're going to want to capture some of this information, especially if you want it to be accurate. Associations, again, like other objects in Provision, activities can be associated with other Provision objects. So for instance, roles, organizations, deliverables, technologies, systems, and so forth. So that's pretty much it about activities. So let's talk about decisions and junctions here really quickly and go over those. A decision is a point where a workflow branches, and in this case it's a binary branch. You can actually have more than a binary branch, which is a one or the other. And it does support the ability to actually define rules around which branch is operated more often. So for instance, an exception process may have fewer executions of one branch. And so you can actually define, for instance, how many exceptions you would expect to see. And again, this is more process simulation, but there's quite a bit of logic that can actually be built into activities, decisions, and junctions within Provision. So a junction is a point where a process converges or diverges. And again, the difference between this and a decision is you take one path or another. With a junction, you can take all paths, whether it's incoming or outgoing. So it can have one or more inputs and one or more outputs. And the junction is actually denoted by this little blue bar here. Okay, so that's it, I think, for the PowerPoint presentation. So we talked about the basic elements of a workflow model. Let's go ahead and actually bring up the a workflow itself. So this is Provision. This is a workflow that actually comes out of the box with Provision as part of the demonstration tools. And again, what we're looking at here is a basic workflow model. In this case, it's a workflow of the business process fill order. So again, some of the different elements. There's the starting point, the ending point, which is a sink. A starting point, again, being a source. And we can bring our model palette up here so we can look at some of the relevant objects for a model, for a workflow model. The actors that participate in it are those who have responsibility for different activities in the process, so manufacturing, field operations, finance, production, an order entry system, and a component vendor. So if we actually wanted to look at some other folks, and let's say we wanted to have a specific role who was associated with this process, for instance, a supervisor, we could just drag that supervisor onto the model palette and it'd actually create a swim lane for us that we could then add activities to. So that's sort of a demonstration of how you can add these swim lanes by just dragging and dropping either existing objects within your Provision system, or you can actually just create them on the fly directly from the model palette itself. Now, in terms of what's available here, you can see these are the different objects that are available for inclusion here. What we did is just drag and drop basically a supervisor role who's going to have responsibility for an activity. To look at the properties, just basically double click on any one of the objects, just like any other model in Provision. Again, the options that are available in terms of properties are going to be based on the context of the object itself. So objects, whether it's an activity or a role, have specific attributes that can be filled out. Decision points, again, different from, say, an activity. So that's the basic model. I think, hopefully, from the PowerPoint presentation, we've seen what some of these things look like. So from this point, I think what we could do is actually go ahead and build a workflow model from scratch. Again, this is an established workflow that comes with the system. I'll show you one other feature here. We can actually interpret this workflow. So this gives us a textual description of how it works. And actually, by clicking on different aspects in the workflow, you can actually go to different points in the workflow. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a workflow modeler or workflow model, and there's a couple of different ways to do that. I can either go here, I can either go to my modeler window and choose to select a workflow modeler. I can give it a business process name of customer complaint. So we're going to talk about how to file a customer complaint, and it will create a workflow model for me based on the customer complaint. I'm going to have a couple of different roles involved with my customer complaint. One of the roles I'm going to have is a customer, and one of the roles I'm going to have is a supervisor. Okay, so the supervisor is going to handle the customer complaint. So that's one way to create a model. Now we could just as easily have gone back here to our model inventory or our model framework and selected a process model.